Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Later, I'll be joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. And coming up tonight, more than 100 people have been arrested for protesting in support of Palestine Action over the weekend. The UK water regulator Ofwat is facing abolition, and GB News have put out a pretty racist documentary, which it seems has backfired. Stay tuned for all of that. Now, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. As ever, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. Straight on to our first story. At least 19 Palestinians in Gaza have starved to death in a single day, a significant increase in the rate of deaths from malnutrition under Israel's ongoing blockade. These include 4-year-old Razan Abu Zaher, who died early on Sunday morning. Also on Sunday, 93 people were killed as they approached a UN convoy carrying flour into northern Gaza in the single deadliest aid distribution massacre to date. Massacres at aid sites have become a near daily occurrence since the US and Israeli-backed so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began operating in May. But despite the regular mass killings, desperate civilians still go to the distribution sites because they have no other way to feed their families. Here you can see the family of a young boy rejoicing because he returned alive and with a bag of flour. And here's famine expert Alex Deir explaining why Israel's starvation of Gaza is unique in the post-World War II period.
I've been working on this topic for more than 4 decades, and there is no case since World War II of starvation that has been so minutely designed and controlled. This is preventable starvation. It is entirely man-made. And every stage of this has been predicted. And at every stage, action could have been taken by Israel, by the international authorities, international community, those who back Israel, to prevent what is happening now from being prevented. And those steps have simply not been taken. And in the last couple of months, what we saw was a total siege of Gaza, followed by a partial lifting. But the partial lifting was not to bring in the kind of humanitarian program that we have been familiar with as humanitarians over the decades. It was to bring in a type of ration program that is simply an arm of the Israeli military.
For those in Gaza who aren't yet so severely malnourished they can't do their work or go about their day-to-day processes, happenings, just witnessing the consequences of this man-made famine is clearly taking an emotional toll. Journalist Anas al-Sharif broke down in tears as he reported from outside Al-Shifa hospital, where people were collapsing in hunger as the bodies of dozens of aid seekers slaughtered by Israeli forces arrived.
محمد وأنا أتحدث إليك أحد النساء هنا سقطت على الأرض الآن أمام بوابة مجمع الشفاء الطبي، سقطت على الأرض من شدة المجاعة ومن شدة الجوع. ومن شدة الجوع كما نشاهد الآن يحاول الأهالي التعامل مع هذه السيدة، وهذا ما كنت أتحدث عنه قبل لحظات. أن الناس يسقطون الآن في شوارع غزة من شدة الجوع، يسقطون على الأرض من شدة الجوع، وهذا المصاب الذي أصيب الآن لا يوجد له علاج، وهذا حال المواطنين جميعا هنا في داخل القطاع.
Following that report, IDF Arabic spokesperson Abike Adri incited against Anas al-Sharif on social media, accusing him of being, quote, a Hamas tool and mouthpiece and crying crocodile tears. Israel has killed over 200 journalists in Gaza since the beginning of its genocidal war and has admitted to targeting journalists for their work. Now, in response to the IDF spokesperson's attack, Anas al-Sharif shared the following plea. Silence or death, the Israeli army is once again threatening journalists for exposing the truth from Gaza. After I reported live on civilians collapsing from hunger, I was directly targeted with public incitement by the army's spokesperson. This is an attempt to silence us and to cover up a genocide unfolding in real time. I call on international officials, human rights defenders, and global media to speak out and share this message. Your voice can help stop the targeting of journalists and protect the truth. Please share, he said. As well as starving the citizens of Gaza and killing them when they seek food, Israel has continued its indiscriminate aerial bombardments against the people of the Strip. And that campaign is currently focused on the city of Deir al Balah, a coastal area in central Gaza, which was the last part of the strip not to have suffered significant bombing. IDF tanks have also pushed into the southern and eastern parts of the city. Now, this follows a forced evacuation order for the 50 to 80,000 people who were sheltering in the area. And of course, around 87% of Gaza is now under such orders. The evacuation, though, of Deir al Balah is especially significant as it includes over 18 headquarters of UN agencies and medical NGOs and many of their staff who live in the area. Here's humanitarian coordinator Ayad Amawi explaining what he believes Israel's goal is.
The occupation's goal behind this order is also to pressure the remaining institutions to halt their operations, preventing them from continuing to provide services to civilians.
Displaced people have been told to head south towards Al-Mawasi and Khan Yunis, an area which is already massively overcrowded, with tens of thousands of Palestinians living in dire humanitarian conditions. Despite previously being designated a safe humanitarian zone, Al-Mawasi has been bombed repeatedly and hundreds of civilians sheltering there have been killed. And Israel's war on Gaza's health workers has also continued. Today, an Israeli Special Forces unit abducted Dr. Marwan al-Hams, who is director of the Kuwait Specialized Hospital and also oversees field hospitals in the Gaza Strip. He was detained outside a Red Cross field hospital in the Al-Mawasi area. And during the abduction, 2 Palestinians were killed by gunfire from Israeli soldiers, including a journalist, Tamer al-Zanin. Another journalist, Ibrahim Abu Shaiba, was injured during the attack. The abduction of Dr. al-Hams is just one more example of Israel systematically targeting healthcare facilities and workers throughout the Gaza genocide. Medical Aid for Palestinians reported that as of May this year, at least 1,400 doctors, nurses, paramedics and surgeons had been killed. Hundreds more have been captured alive and subjected to brutal torture, including sexual torture in Israeli prisons. At least 3, Dr. Adnan al-Bush, Dr. Iyad al-Rantisi and paramedic Hamdan Abu Annaba, have been killed in Israeli custody. Back to the atrocities just committed in the last 24 hours. Today, Israel bombed a water desalination plant in northern Gaza, killing at least 5 people and wounding several more. Gaza is facing severe water shortages due to systematic targeting of water infrastructure by Israel, and that's part of its broader effort to destroy all means of sustaining human life in the territory. Today, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, shared the following testimony from an employee in Gaza. We're in the death phase. Everything around people at the moment is death, whether it's bombs or strikes, children wasting away in front of their eyes from malnourishment, from dehydration and dying. Doctors and nurses are watching children disappear and die in front of their eyes, and there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. To discuss the latest news coming out of Gaza, I spoke earlier today to Dr. Mohammed Mustafa. Dr. Mustafa is an English-Australian emergency physician of Palestinian heritage. He worked as a medic in Gaza from March to April earlier this year. Since then, he has appeared on multiple platforms speaking out against Israel's genocide. And last week, he was denied re-entry into Gaza by Israel. They don't like people going there to help a people they are genociding and then speak to the media about it. I started by asking him about what he thinks the aim is of the Deir al Balah evacuation.
Well, I think the goal is the final solution here. Deir al Balah is the area that coordinates now any form of healthcare, any form of aid distribution, any form of food distribution. It's the only place that has some form of self-governance and capabilities to provide clean water, to provide bakeries, and the infrastructure is there to allow transport of goods to be moved around these bakeries. If they go to Deir al Balah, not only are these organizations' infrastructures destroyed, which makes it hard for them to operate in Gaza, but it also means any kind of form of life left in Gaza is destroyed. It's the only real big major area that's not been invaded yet. And usually when the Israelis go in and invade, they then demolish all the homes and any infrastructures that are there. So I really think this is, to make that humanitarian city in Rafah a reality, they have to destroy what's left of Gaza.
You've worked in Gaza, since this genocidal war began as a medic. You've more recently been denied re-entry. Can you talk about that? What was the reason given as to why you're not allowed to return to Gaza to do your job?
They never really give you a reason why you're not allowed to return. You get given clearance a few hours before the entry. But I think not just me. There's a lot of other doctors who have made the rounds on media, who have gained some notoriety, who have a large platform. They don't want those kind of doctors returning back to Gaza because with us comes the cameras in the eyes as well that comes on to Gaza. So I think that's probably the reason is I've made a bit too much noise since leaving Gaza the last time.
And I suppose that's in a way sending a message, isn't it, to other doctors? If you want to work in Gaza, sort of helping people in a desperate situation, you better shut up about what the Israelis are doing. I mean, is that the message you think other medics will be receiving?
Well, I mean, that's what I know. I mean, I have a lot of doctors who tell me that, they commend me for what I'm doing, but they say that they would never do it because they want to go back to Gaza. So a lot of doctors self-censor themselves, but it's not even just doctors who self-censor themselves. It's media personalities, it's celebrities. There is a whole culture around not talking about this, and there are punishments and repercussions, whether you're punished by not returning to Gaza, whether you're punished by losing your job. This is, I think it's now obvious. We've had in Australia, where I'm based, we had a very famous reporter who lost her job for sharing a post from a major charity organization saying that starvation was being used as a weapon of war, which now can't be denied. And, they went to court with the ABC, which is, one of the largest networks there, and she won. She won the lawsuit there. So this is happening all over, not just in the medical field, but in the journalism, in NGOs, at the UN, politicians, celebrities. A lot of people are self-censoring because they're scared to speak up. But, right now, what we're facing and the images that we're seeing out of Gaza, I don't think you can be scared anymore. It's more scary being someone in Gaza than it is being out of Gaza. We need to speak up because we are watching people literally being funneled into cages and being gunned down. These are not images that we expected to see in 2025. We thought we'd seen the last of those images 80 years ago.
And some of the most distressing images that have been circulating, especially this weekend, is of malnutrition, starving people. And my understanding is that 19 people have died of starvation in the past 24 hours. Do you think we're reaching some kind of tipping point here where, we've heard for months now of sort of the risk of severe famine? Are we now in the severe famine where lots of people we can expect to die because they've been denied food by Israel?
Well, it's now been graded. Now the famine has been graded as grade 5. That's the most severe form of famine. That's where we are expecting to have two. I'm not 100% sure on this list, but I think it's 2 out of every 10,000 to die of malnutrition in 24 hours, which is what we're seeing. You've got to remember a lot of this is underreported as well. People are dying on the streets. People are dying at home. And, if your loved one dies, you don't have to bring them to hospital to be counted, just be told that they're dead. So you bury them. So people just bury them at home. Colleagues that I know, that I've worked with, they've messaged me and they've said that they are struggling to operate because the surgeons are collapsing in the operating theatre due to the lack of food and water, that they can't continue working because of just how malnourished even the doctors are. So, we're reaching, the Al Jazeera journalist, Anas Al-Jari, he broke down into tears, crying. Now, he's been at the forefront and he's watched all of his colleagues being killed and assassinated, but I've never seen him break down on live TV before. But he broke down because he said in Arabic, everyone around him is dropping like flies from hunger. So we're seeing a new side of this now. When I was there in June last year, we were seeing children who had come in emaciated, who were dying from starvation, who died from starvation and hepatitis A and things like that. But, that was in June last year. And we're seeing that probably tenfold now. There was a video that went viral the other day that died while queuing for food, just died from hunger while queuing for food. The images that we're seeing right now are really harrowing. And I didn't think we would get to this stage. As bad as what's happened over the last 2 years, what we're seeing now is completely different than what we've seen before.
And presumably the most extreme consequence for people of famine is that they die. I would imagine that even if people do survive this, if aid starts flowing once again, that sort of a period of prolonged malnutrition has lasting effects on someone's health, especially if this happens to them as a child. Could you talk about that? What could be the lasting impacts of the famine that's being imposed on Gaza?
Well, look, things like brain development of children, kids can learn up to like 21 languages before the age of 5 years old. Their brains are like a sponge. But that also comes with the consequences as well, because the brain also is very vulnerable at that time. So the lack of nutrients for children at that age and the lack of nutrients for children going through puberty means that not only will they have stunted growth that they will not recover from the rest of their life, but, brain development, nerve development, vision, hearing, neurological pathways being developed, all of these things will be underdeveloped. And there might not be a resolution to this, even when you provide them with an adequate diet for the rest of their lives. And it's not just that as well, it's the outbreak of illnesses because of the malnutrition. So, when you get a child who's got pneumonia and they can't recover from pneumonia because they don't have the calories to fight off this infection, they're going to have poor lungs for the rest of their lives. And that might also mean a poor heart as well, because the heart's working in overtime to try and pump oxygen around the body when there's a poor supply of it from the infected lungs. So these issues that we're going to have just from a nutritional point of view is going to be devastating to this next generation. But that's not even including the psychological trauma in Gaza. Before the war, 40% of the children in Gaza had symptoms of PTSD. Now, it wouldn't be an over-exaggeration to say 100% of the children in Gaza have some form of PTSD. And even that alone, just combating the mental health issues that you get from Gaza would be very difficult. So, we haven't just lost one generation in Gaza. We've lost 1 million children in Gaza. They've been out of school for 2 years as well. So children are behind at school. They're behind with their nutrition. They're behind with their development. They're behind with their psychological development. And then we talk about the largest cohort of child amputees in the world. We're talking about one of the largest cohorts per capita of orphans as well. And there's no solution to this. And I'm telling you this as somebody who's been trying to work and lobbying governments to try and get a resolution to this. The UN, it counts the amount of children orphans there are in Gaza, but there's no support for these orphans. There's no safe houses for these, or no adequate safe houses for these. There's no carers for these orphans. They've been looked after by family members and sometimes strangers. We don't have a day after plan. And that is the truth. The UN, governments, they don't have a day after plan for Gaza. And when I mean a day after plan, I don't mean a day after plan where we put them in a concentration camp and we ethnically cleanse Gaza. I mean an actual day after plan of how we help recover and rehabilitate and rebuild the Gaza Strip with its population. There is no plan.
And let's talk about the very immediate issue of how more food could get into Gaza. Now, obviously, it's Israel who have made the decision to impose a famine on the people of Gaza as a form of collective punishment to try and kick people out of that strip, or sort of force them into a state of desperation where they have no choice but to ask to leave. Western governments clearly not putting enough pressure on Israel to lift that siege. There is also the question of Egypt. I mean, could Egypt just unilaterally allow food in via the Rafah crossing? Because, I mean, you would imagine Egyptian citizens will be seeing these images as well, and the idea that Egypt is colluding with Israel to stop any food getting into Gaza and helping enforce a an explicitly intentionally imposed, let's say, famine. What could you tell us about that? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I went to Egypt for the march for Gaza to break the siege. And, even when we arrived at airports, people were being arrested. And remember, this was an organized march that was organized through the Egyptian government, and it had approval from embassies to go. And there was a cohort of over 50 country delegations that were there. And, the Egyptian government had paid locals to beat up people on this march. It had deported people when they arrived. It beat people up, put them in jail. The organizer was put in jail for a few days and interrogated. In Jordan right now, we're seeing, people who are speaking out against what's going on in Palestine being arrested as well. There is a concerted effort in the whole of the region to stifle any protest of what's going on. And, I can't tell you what goes on behind closed doors. I can't tell you whether they are colluding or not colluding. But, there isn't necessarily a concerted effort to break the siege and bring in trucks with the army behind to bring this in. There's none of that kind of stuff that we've seen. But again, if you are a leader in the Arab world, you're going to be very, very cautious about what goes on, because you've seen how unhinged the Israeli regime is. And, they are not afraid to open up a new front and regime change in multiple countries all at the same time. It's what's happening in Syria right now, what they're trying to do, what they tried to do in Iran, and, what they're trying to do in Lebanon as well. So, and what they're trying to do in Gaza as well. So, we're talking about these governments are scared. Regardless of whether they're colluding or not, I also feel that they're probably very, very scared of what could happen to them as well. And, it's like the whole region has been taken hostage. The whole region is being taken hostage. As many grievances that I have with the Arab regimes and dictators in the Middle East, I've also got to understand that everyone in the Middle East, nobody is safe. Nobody is safe in the Middle East. Not even the leaders in the Middle East are safe. Jalani, who's now the leader of Syria, this guy was a wanted man a few years ago with a $10 million bounty on his head. Now he's shaking hands with the president. I mean, that to me just signifies how quickly things change in the Middle East. You could be the best friends with the United States, and tomorrow you could be a wanted man. Gaddafi was having tea at Buckingham Palace, and a few years later he was sodomized to death by NATO allies. So, this is what I mean when I say the whole Middle East just hangs at a knife edge, and it's constant like this for the people of the Middle East and for the governments in the Middle East. So, is there collusion? I mean, there probably is some form of collusion, but the other thing as well is there's just huge instability. If Egypt starts driving trucks into Gaza, that could open up another front. And, there's 110 million people in Egypt. They are at the knife edge of poverty and debt. I don't think even if they wanted to do something that they could do something. I mean, they are literally beholden to their debt. Lebanon is in a state of chaos. They have regular power outages. They've been in civil wars for 30 odd years. They've not really had any stability. And the entire south of Lebanon has pretty much been leveled. And Syria has been in civil war for 12 years, and there's sectarian warfare and communities that are all divided. At the end of the day, the problem isn't just as simple as governments are colluding with Israel. The problem is that the whole Middle East and the makeup of the Middle East for decades has been unstable. These allies and enemies are very interchangeable. One day you're an enemy, the next day you're a friend, and one day you're a friend, and the next day you're killed by your own people, sodomized to death. So, listen, it's a very complicated situation over there, and I would hate to say something that's just, not true. The truth is no one's really got the right answer here. There's a lot of things that go on behind closed doors that we don't know.
Over 100 people were arrested this weekend for protesting the prescription of Palestine Action. Protesters across the country held placards with the word, quote, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." The Met Police said 55 people were arrested in London on suspicion of terrorism offences, for displaying placards in support of the banned group. Here's the moment one of those protesters was arrested.
I'm here to demand the government de-prescribe Palestine Action. It was a ridiculous thing to prescribe a peaceful organisation. They are not terrorists.
And you're a doctor?
I am indeed.
Do you think it's appropriate they're being arrested for this action?
Well, I'm thinking about all the medical staff, the medical facilities in Gaza that have been destroyed by the genocide, by the Israeli Defence Forces. They've deliberately targeted healthcare workers. Many hundreds have died, and all the healthcare facilities have been damaged, if not completely destroyed, in this onslaught against the Palestinian people. So the people now haven't got access to healthcare like they once had.
Do you know what this police officer is looking for on you?
Possibly any incriminating evidence, I suppose.
Sorry, what are you looking for, Constable?
So under Police and Criminal Evidence Act, we can look for anything that may be related to the offence.
Related to the offence? What is the offence?
Probably not at liberty to disclose that. It's between me and this gentleman.
We need to protect our democracy and our freedom to speak out. These are our rights to protest. If we don't, we're going to lose them. We just simply cannot turn a blind eye to the genocide going on in Gaza.
Very brave man. Here's another of the arrestees.
And shame on the state of Israel for what they're doing to the Palestinian people at the moment.
Are you going to stand up for the search?
No, I'm bloody not.
No, I'm bloody not. I mean, something I come back whenever I see clips like this, I do feel like, older women who don't take shit are kind of the moral bastion of the country in many ways, I think. 17 more were arrested in Bristol, 16 in Manchester, 4 in Liverpool, and 8 outside Truro Cathedral in Cornwall. That included an 81-year-old former magistrate. Today, Palestine Action co-founder Huda Amori asked the High Court for permission to challenge the group's prescription through a judicial review. Lawyers representing the group argued the prescription made the UK an international outlier, as direct action is typically treated as activism rather than terrorism. Blina Ni Harali, who also represented South Africa in the ICJ genocide case against Israel, contended there is near consensus in the human rights world that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and said it is doing this with parts provided by arms firms in Britain. She added that Palestine Action's main target, Israeli arms firm Elbit Systems, plays a key role in these war crimes and crimes against humanity. Nihrali also argued the prescription was having an impact on the right to protest beyond the strict bounds of the law, citing the following incident in Kent.
What's your intention here tonight? My intention is to wave this flag and keep Palestine in the public consciousness right now.
So do you support any prescribed group?
I do not support any prescribed group.
Okay.
I support a free Palestine and the end of genocide.
So Judge Chamberlain actually said that the officers there clearly misunderstood the law, but Nihrali countered that nobody had come out and said they did anything wrong. So this is a quote: Kent has not issued an apology or a retraction. The Secretary of State has not come out and said that this is a manifest misapplication of the law. So it's all well and good for the judge to say, well, this is just one cop misunderstanding the law. Why should we worry? And this lawyer rightly pointing out, well, no one has said this isn't a correct application of the law. So why would you not expect other police officers to do similarly or take similar actions which also misunderstand the law? She also cited another example, which she called an egregious example, where a protester was arrested for carrying a reproduction of a satirical image from Private Eye. So this is the image. So it says, Palestine Action explained, unacceptable Palestine Action spraying military planes with paint, acceptable Palestine Action shooting Palestinians queuing for food. So someone who held that up was arrested. She also mentioned submissions from Novara Media and Declassified UK regarding concerns about implications for press freedom, and said there was, quote, sheer confusion as to what journalists can and cannot publish now. Lawyers acting for the government argued that judicial review is an inappropriate forum for reviewing prescription, and that the case should instead be reviewed by the Prescribed Organisations Appeal Commission. That's a specialised tribunal established by Parliament, which can more easily, they say, review evidence provided to closed court. Lawyers for Palestine Action countered that the Home Secretary's case for prescription doesn't rely on secret evidence necessitating a closed court, and that judicial review would provide a speedy remedy, whereas it's unclear how long review by the POAC, so the special tribunal, would take. We had been expecting a ruling today. However, Judge Chamberlain has decided to withhold judgment until next week. There will be a further hearing on Wednesday, the 30th of July, when the full judgment will be handed down to both parties. I'm now joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that, like myself, you're going to sort of struggle to make any predictions and engage in how this is sort of going to go down in a court of law. And so I was going to ask you about something which I know both of us, I suppose, can comment on, which is these images of doctors, of 81-year-old magistrates being arrested by police because they oppose a genocide in Gaza.
I mean, it's obviously very, very silly. And I'm seeing loads of people who are watching this must also believe it to be silly as well. Instead, they're trying to impugn essentially peaceful demonstrators as terrorists, right? Like, we can see all of the images that we've talked about and seen so far today in this show. These things can be broadcast on the media, through social media, through any amount of channels, right? And we can't label that as terrorism, or at least we are told that this isn't terrorism. What the IOF is doing to the people of Palestine, this isn't terrorism. We know who the real terrorists are. It's the 81-year-old ladies protesting the grotesque images that we continue to see every single day, right? The idea that somehow that these people are terrorists, that what is even, if we just take all the actions of Palestine Action completely out of the equation here, right? Obviously, I don't believe that what Palestine Action done, it necessitates terrorism, but they are also trying to impugn anybody who says any words of support for them or holds signs in support of them or even holds satirical images in support of them as potentially being terrorists themselves. And that is the whole problem with the action of proscription in the first place. It's the chilling effect that surrounds it that is such an issue. And that's why there have been people from the UN who have said that we are an international outlier in terms of who we do and don't prescribe as being terrorists, and then who levies their support. Again, these are the issues with regards to the free speech implications that's the problem. Not only are we seeing people who make supportive statements being arrested, again, that is illegal under the proscription law. They do leave themselves open to arrest. Now, we can sit here and debate the merits, which we obviously don't believe many merits exist on our side of this equation, right? But on top of this, there is the chilling effect around it, where people who say things that could potentially be construed, right? Well, there's a lot of ambiguity in the term of whether it's potentially could be construed that way, that allows there to be, as we have seen, people who are members of law enforcement take matters into their own hands and to misapply where that law is. But then again, who judges what the correct application is when you can essentially arrest somebody on suspicion of anything, right? Like if you turn up at a protest that is about, quote unquote, defending the right of people to support Palestine Action, if that's in the case what these people were doing, I don't know what the initial description internally of the protest was. If you are there but not even saying anything specifically in support of Palestine Action, they can have suspicion, and then of course then you potentially leave yourself open to being arrested, and that is the problem, right? This chilling effect can go very, very far. And again, just as I opened up my segment with, I opened up my contribution, the idea that retired doctors and magistrates are terrorists essentially because of their position on our government's relationship with regards to foreign policy, it beggars belief, it really does, when we see actual terrorism happening to the Palestinians every day, and yet our government are the people who are flying spy flights for these people, who are training IDF soldiers in the United Kingdom and allowing jets to refuel on their way to Israel in RAF Bryce Norton. It really is topsy-turvy world in Starmer's Britain.
No one is happy with England and Wales's water companies. While shareholders make tidy profits, sewage continues to get pumped into our rivers, and companies like Thames Water are on the brink of collapse. But who's to blame? Well, a new government commissioned report, has pointed the finger at Ofwat. They're the water regulator, and the government has accepted their recommendations, and it's now set to be abolished. Private water companies will now be governed by a new, more powerful authority, combining the previous roles of Ofwat, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and the Environment Agency. All very exciting, I know. What, though, about getting rid of the companies themselves and bringing water back into public ownership? Well, the author of today's report, Sir John Cunliffe, he's a former Deputy Bank of England Governor. He said this.
First, I understand that many people who responded to our work are concerned about profit in the provision of water through a monopoly system and how that has impacted what has happened. However, I do believe the system can work. I believed in the years after privatisation, leakage went down by 30%, environmental pollution incidents went down by 40%. There was that massive increase in investment, and I am old enough to remember what it was like before, and the public management and funding of our water systems left us as the dirty man of Europe. So I think we focus too much on this point. This system can work, but if you are to have a system of private regulated monopolies, you have to have the regulation that has the powers and the knowledge and the capacity to deliver what we want.
So is John Cunliffe right? Is water renationalisation a distraction? Well, that's certainly a line Labour has been pleased to accept. They've ruled out bringing water back into public ownership. Someone who disagrees, though, is director of the Commonwealth think tank, Matthew Lawrence, who I spoke to earlier today.
So public ownership is not the distraction, it's the solution. It's the solution to a systemic failure in the water industry that stretches back decades now, in which rampant profiteering has extracted over £80 billion worth of dividends for shareholders, international shareholders, chronically underinvested in our water system, which now sees sewage being spilt into our waterways, to our seas, into our rivers, and yet CEOs being rewarded for failure. And the Cunliffe review does have some sensible sort of tweaks, but the reality is it doesn't address the systemic failure of privatisation. privatisation which makes England really an outlier, not even the UK, because Scotland retained public ownership and has better results. England is such an outlier. 90% of the world have public ownership of water in some way or other and have better results. And so it was a real missed opportunity to say, look, we know there's a big problem here. We're going to get to the grips with the root of it here, rather than just kind of pushing away public ownership because it's deemed ideologically off message. And I think that's a real missed opportunity, because I don't think it will resolve the fundamental issues that the public really clearly care about.
So in that clip, John Cunliffe was sort of saying, everyone says nationalisation would be a good idea, but I remember before water was privatised, and it was even worse. Then we were the sick man of Europe when it came to water. I'm not sure exactly the quote he used, but the suggestion, we hear this as well, don't we, with the rail service, was that you might think the privatised system is bad. It was even worse beforehand. How do you respond to that kind of argument?
Look, rather than having pretty dodgy history lessons and personal anecdotes, why don't we look in the present, live in the present, where we see in Paris, which re-municipalised, so took back into public ownership a failed privatisation water experiment, has recently reopened the Seine for swimming, while the UK, obviously, clearly that is not possible in many of the waterways of England. We can look at Scottish Water, which wasn't privatised, and it has managed to keep bills lower, investment higher, and better water quality than English water companies. So we don't need to sort of reach back for John Cunliffe's memories of what he thinks water systems were like in the 70s. We can talk about what the water system is like in the 2020s. And what we see is rampant profiteering, we see rewards for failure, and we see a regulatory regime which is just unable to deal with the fundamental problem. This essential, life-giving resource has been turned into a vehicle for profit, a vehicle for commodification, and there is no way that regulators can get around that problem.
I suppose it's often the case, isn't it, that this is a sort of independent investigation by someone the government appointed, and the government presumably wouldn't have appointed someone who would have come out and said, actually, the real issue is who owns the water companies. Let's talk about the actual recommendations. I find it, sometimes I struggle to get animated about whether Ofwat will be replaced by a different regulator, combining the powers of a different regulators. It all sounds very technocratic. Is this good? Is this bad? What do you make of the actual recommendations in the report?
So within the kind of box that they're playing within, which is the wrong box, but within that box, I think there are some reasonable sort of improvements here. I think combining some of the regulatory powers, which are currently fragmented across an array of agencies, into a single, more beefed up, more powerful regulator is probably a step forwards, and it is welcome. But again, I think we're kind of trying to sort of slip the blame onto Ofwat here, and then the government's narrative of saying, it's a failure of regulation. And if it wasn't for poor regulators, then these private companies would have been able to deliver the investment, the outcomes we needed. But I think that's looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope. And the whole point of this privatized regulatory model we have is we do need a regulator. Imagine a world in which you had privatized monopolies that had no oversight at all. That would clearly be ridiculous to rip the public off even more. So the nature of privatization actually involves more state bureaucracy and more of this kind of thicket of overlap of regulators, rules, new sort of regimes of government oversight, because you need to guard against private excess. And so public ownership is a way of actually stripping back that and just saying we're going to have one public owned company or sort of network of publicly owned water companies. You don't need sort of a regulator to stop them gaming it, because their purpose would not be to profiteer, to maximize revenues and sort of income for shareholders. It would be to say, what do we need to do to build a secure, safe, affordable water system, and then build a business plan around that. And that is common. This is not kind of utopianism. This is common across most of the countries of the world, which have better outcomes on cost of bills, in terms of investment, in terms of sort of safety of waters. And so, the regulator, these reforms are welcome, but again, they really are missing the wood from the trees.
And what's your analysis of why Labour don't want to renationalise the water? Polling suggests that on the face of it, the public would be open to it and, relatively keen on the idea of renationalising water. I think over the weekend, Steve Reed, so he's the cabinet member in charge, suggested they don't want to do it because it would cost, he said, £100 billion, and they've got other things they want to spend the money on. I don't know what you think of that particular statistic, but I suppose what's your analysis with what's going on with this Labour government?
So I think there's a bunch of things there worth unpacking. So I think, in a way, the political strategy of Starmerism is to say, well, if it's popular with the public and if it seems a popular left-wing proposal, we will run a mile from that. So actually the very fact that it's popular, I think, is one of the reasons why they're not reaching for that lever, because it's seen as, well, that's a bit of a sort of a legacy of the past that their whole political project is trying to distance itself from. So I think that's part of the political logic, and actually the popularity in some ways doesn't help it. I think on the kind of economic strategy of the government, I think clearly the Chancellor has chosen a strategy of rebuilding Britain, so energy systems, waterways, housing, not through large-scale public investment. They have, in fairness, increased public investment substantially, but not to a large-scale degree, and instead relying on asset managers and international capital investing in de-risked asset classes. So the government essentially saying, don't worry, we'll make sure that if you invest in the water system, you'll be guaranteed a certain return. Or don't worry, if you invest in buy-to-let, sort of housing, we'll make sure that you're guaranteed a certain level of return, that your sort of investments are not at risk. Which does beg the question, well, what's the point of capitalism and capitalists if they're not going to invest with risk? But I think that the economic strategy of the government precludes, in a way, public ownership, because they are interested in this kind of bringing in private international capital and de-risking it. And I think taking the water system into public ownership would be sort of a breach in that strategy. And then the third thing on the cost, which is worth confronting, well, I think this 100 billion figure, it's the kind of straw, the reed that broke the camel's back, to use a Steve Reed pun, which is probably not necessary. But this figure is often sort of bandied around as a figure that was produced in a report in the late 2010s, funded by the water companies. It is Commonwealth's actually done a study by a law professor, Ewan McGaughey, at King's College London, which kind of deconstructs this and shows it's essentially nonsense and based on a series of inflated claims that just don't stack up. And actually the real cost is much closer to zero than it is to 100 billion. And obviously the cost would be negotiated. But I think the key thing here with all public ownership claims, because you hear this a lot about renationalising the energy system or the railways or wherever it might be, is that you're not just, you've got to look at both sides of the balance sheet. So you are, yes, you might have to borrow to buy this, but you are buying then an asset which will be publicly owned and generate income, and which you could use strategically, coherently, and improve the outcomes of the country. And so really the kind of hiding behind those type of figures, I just think is deeply disingenuous. I'm not sure Steve Reed is being disingenuous himself, but I think the politics of that are disingenuous, because it fails to sort of really think through the nature of what you're doing. You're acquiring an asset, you're not just spending money, you're buying systemic resilience, you're buying systemic coherence. And I think that's the fundamental thing. By trying to regulate this, we are leaving the water system in a sort of incoherent, cost ineffective and fragmented state that is just not going to lead to better outcomes. Whereas public ownership, whether it's water, energy, transport infrastructure, it offers you coherence, it offers you cost effectiveness, and it offers you sort of certainty of knowing that the priority is the public, not profiteering.
That was king of very wonky puns, Matthew Lawrence from Commonwealth, speaking to me earlier today. Helena, do you want to comment on this briefly? I know you feel passionately about us all getting screwed over by the water companies.
I do. One thing I did wanted to point out from John Cunliffe's pretty botched history lesson there about the lack of investment in the water sector under the regional water boards before they were privatised, right? He's not necessarily incorrect. What he misses out is the fact that the Thatcher administration quite literally passed legislation that banned the regional water boards from accessing private capital to be able to invest. The whole reason why there was this huge slew of investment post-privatisation was because all of those laws were lifted once they stopped being regional water boards. And this was deliberately done because at the time, there was new water quality adherence protocols coming through from the European Union, right? Insofar as we would need to start adhering to these new protocols, and the regional water boards couldn't make the investment because of this legislation to get water quality up to these certain standards. So that meant that then the post-privatisation, they had to, once they had access to private capital because they were no longer bound by this legislation, do that investment to reach that standard. So the idea that this was somehow unique to privatisation and not the specifically designed kind of thing that was supposed to happen with regards to the regional water boards under Thatcher, deliberately hamstringing them to force through nationalisation is a really shallow reinterpretation of history there from Mr. Cunliffe. And I also want to make the point that we make all of this discussion about sewage and what's happening in our waterways is really important. But also when it comes to things such as the actual management of the companies themselves. One of the big scandals was the fact that previous asset managers who've come in to own our water companies, the private water companies, the way they managed to take out so much in terms of shares, in terms of dividends, was because they took on debt, private debt, and paid it basically all out. All of it went out in dividends, and basically none of it went into reinvestment. Because of the fact that it's a monopoly, they knew full well that they would then be able to hike up bills to then pay down that debt, having got their bonanza afterwards. This is a unique fact of the private ownership model of a natural monopoly. No other company can really get away with it. I know that private equity does love a good asset strip every now and again, but they don't have a captive consumer base in the way that the natural monopoly of water delivery does, which meant that there was obviously no way of being able to do this. And now they want to put the water bills up saying, well, we need to pay for the investment. That was what the debt was supposed to be. And because the extra investment should therefore necessitate a better service, they can then pay down the debt. And on top of this, right, the debt that they owe is at like a 12% interest rate. That's almost triple what the government can do if they, for example, nationalised it, having made the share price to be zero because of the assets versus liabilities, and then took on the debt themselves, which they can then restructure by trading it for a government bond, which would be massively smaller in terms of the loan repayments than the current debt paid for by the private entities. There's just no argument against this stuff. There really isn't. And so much for Steve Reed saying he's pragmatic but not ideological, when there is absolutely nothing pragmatic about an industry that is so haphazardly run that you essentially have to run it by proxy via a regulator, right? When the government is basically having to decide what the company does via a proxy regulator, why are we not just nationalising it? It makes no sense.
Nick the Peasant with a super chat says, any party, think tank or pundit trying to extol the virtue of privatisation is shameless and repugnant. Also, love hearing Helena's take, as always. Helena has consistently very good takes, very well researched. I'm always impressed by the depth of your knowledge. I struggle sometimes to give meaningful contributions when it comes to water, because sometimes I do switch off when I'm reading about it. But you made that very interesting, so thank you. Before we go on to our final story, one way you can support Novara Media is through buying merchandise from our shop. Do you want to look like this? Do you want to wear a t-shirt like this? We'll go to our website. All the profits of books, t-shirts or bags go directly to funding Novara Media's journalism. You can, of course, go to shop.novaramedia.com to see what we've got. Our very handsome merch manager, Tom, makes sure all the products on the shop are as ethical as they can be. Who wrote that for me? Even with no ethical consumption under capitalism, you still need to wear t-shirts. And these ones have all their profits directed to Novara Media. This sounds nothing like me. 30 to 70% of anything you buy goes directly to sustaining and developing Novara Media. The rest covers the cost of making it, eco-friendly inks, organic cotton, plastic-free embroidery, all at a fair price, from XS to 5XL. There are also books, including those written by Novara staff like Ash and Aaron, as well as by our illustrious downstream guests. And whatever you buy, it's posted to you in recyclable packaging. So visit shop.novaramedia.com. So I feel like in those live podcasts where they're always sort of extolling the virtues of what's it called, Better Health, the one where you sort of get therapy online. I've always wanted to do that. It makes me feel actually very professional. But yeah, do go buy Novara Media merch. I might not have written that advert, but I did via my own agency acquire this t-shirt and do wear it with pride. The radical left are often accused of not loving their country, but it's the radical right who now seem to really hate the place that they live. Opposition to and even disgust towards multicultural Britain is now being expressed by right-wingers, complaining that Britain, a supposedly ancient and noble culture, has become the UK. Now, the UK, in this sort of concept, is spelt Y-O-O-K-A-Y. Now, the UK concept, it was developed on Twitter, mainly involves right-wingers sharing pictures of majority ethnic minority areas and businesses with an air of disapproval. So they'll post a picture of a halal butcher's next to a chicken shop and say, "Oh God, this is the horrible multicultural UK aesthetic." It's also become a major talking point in right-wing outlets like The Critic and The Telegraph, where the idea has been endorsed by former Tory Minister David Frost. In that Telegraph piece from November, Frost describes the UK aesthetic, or what he calls the UK aesthetic, in the following way. The term was initially used to symbolise the particular aesthetic quality of much of the modern UK, that jarring mixture of cultures bolted onto the pre-existing British environment. The American candy store next to the kebab shop with its modern signage stuck onto a half-timbered building, the scattered line bikes and discarded Deliveroo bags slung wherever on the street, and the soundtrack of modern Britain, multicultural London English with its global slang, the drill music on the train without headphones. If you live in a city, you recognise it. Now, as you can probably tell, the UK argument is a fairly naked attempt to blame all of Britain's woes, be that poor housing, decrepit high streets, or even the existence of line bikes, on ethnic minorities. And GB News is the latest right-wing outlet to jump on the bandwagon. They released a documentary over the weekend called UK, so obviously spelled Y-O-O-K-A-Y, versus Britain, How Immigration Transformed a Nation.
Britain, an ancient place. It now has new sights, new smells, new sounds.
Stepped in the party, steady. The big back's on shake already.
Mama said don't cry no more. Mama said don't cry no more.
And even a new name.
The new name being UK. I mean, we're going to come back to this actually, but that intro, I think, speaks to a lot of the beef that these people have, which is not that, you know, well, I mean, their beef is that there are too many immigrants in this country, but the argument seems to be that without immigrants, we would still be a rural kind of Anglo-Saxon society where we lived in castles and everyone was a shepherd. Not that that ever was the history, but sort of, that's what that intro is getting to. We used to have lovely fields with sheep and castles, and now we have butchers in Brixton. It's like, I'm not quite sure how the causality is working there. And the documentary did have many Alan Partridge-esque moments, including this.
In old Britain, culture meant Shakespeare and Elgar. In the UK, it's masked rappers, viral beefs, and beats soaked in violence.
You can't blame the fact that Elgar is no longer in the charts on black people, right? They simply didn't cause that to happen, right? Elgar lived 100 years ago, Shakespeare 400 years ago. This idea that, I mean, I don't want to be in a world where we just read Shakespeare and listen to Elgar. I mean, maybe that's what Steve Edgington wants. But whether or not you want it, the reason we don't have it has nothing to do with immigration, right? It wasn't immigrants that stopped us listening to Elgar. I don't know why he's missed out the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Sex Pistols. He's suddenly just gone from Elgar to drill music and there was nothing in between. So I think fairly humorous so far. But it's a clip from the documentary GB News shared on Twitter that has got the most pushback.
What does it mean to be British for you?
So obviously, like me, me being British, yeah, it's all good and yeah, because obviously, like I was born here, born in this country in 1997, the 20th of November 1997, and to me, yeah, it's South London. South London is my home innit, and obviously Stockwell, that I grew up going to, that it's my home as well innit. Stockwell, Clapham, Brixton as well is my home as well.
But what about Britain?
What Britain? Yeah, Britain's my home innit.
You like it?
Yeah. Since 27 years on this earth, yeah, it's been amazing, yeah, and obviously the things have changed for good.
I'm going to name some British legends from history, and I want you to respond. What do you think of them? Alfred the Great, Winston Churchill, Lord Nelson, the Duke of Wellington. What do you think of these people?
Well, what I will say about these people is, you know, they're just doing what they got to do, you know.
What do you think are British values?
British values, it's a tricky one. Still, it's a tricky one, innit? It's a tricky one, innit? British values, yeah. Is this something to do with cost of living or something?
That was a really nice seeming guy, right? Who I don't think knew that he was being interviewed for a documentary which was trying to say multiculturalism ruined Britain. And then a supposed gotcha is that he didn't know who Alfred the Great is. And maybe I should be embarrassed to admit this, but I didn't know who Alfred the Great was, right? And I'm a white guy. My parents are British. I did PPE at Oxford, right? I don't drop this very often, right? But I did the most establishment degree you can ever do. Alfred the Great. I listened to history podcasts. I listened to The Rest is History, right? I listened to The Rest is for my sins. And I didn't actually know who Alfred the Great was. He was an Anglo-Saxon, I've looked it up today, he was an Anglo-Saxon king who didn't quite unify England, but who kind of got us some of the way there. I don't know, someone is going to be able to explain this better than me, who I sort of just looked this up this morning on Wikipedia. That video has been viewed over 7 million times on Twitter, but I think mainly because people don't like it. So there have been lots of people complaining about this, and they include people from the left and from the right. Rakib Ehsan, who regularly writes for The Telegraph and Spiked, so I think we can say he's somewhat on the right, said this. This was a failed gotcha attempt. The lad says Britain is his home and that his life has been amazing. Good on him. As for not having a clue about Alfred the Great and the Duke of Wellington, I suspect that would be the case for most young people across the ethnicities. I think that would be the case for most people in general across the ethnicities. I think Alfred the Great is not as famous as some people are suggesting. People who weighed in were also other GB News hosts. So Martin Daubney hosts their sort of weekday afternoon show. He says, to be fair, how many white kids would know about Alfred the Great? I know Brixton, this lad seems solid. I'd buy him a pint. What's the problem? And then it got worse for the documentary makers once the brother of the man interviewed gave some extra context. So he says, you've plastered this video all over your social media channels, taking advantage of my autistic older brother for views and to push your weird anti-black narrative. As a news company that should be responsible, this shouldn't have been posted, but oh, well. That got lots of people agreeing with that, basically. Steve Edgington, though, who made the film, doubled down by retweeting a bunch of pretty racist defenses of the film, including this. So someone called Harrison Pitt said, this gentleman seems like a nice chap. And this is, sorry, by the way, quoting the Rakib Ehsan tweet that I played you, or that I read to you earlier. It says, this gentleman seems like a nice chap, but Steve Edgington helps to show that he is anything but assimilated. And then it's, Huguenot-descended Brits are in all relevant respects invisible. Meanwhile, Edgington's interviewee associates Britain with its most conquered, colonised UK areas. Ehsan clearly cares nothing for this country's host people. Ehsan, by the way, is always writing about sort of integration, and often from a very small C conservative perspective. I think the fact that he is non-white has maybe caused Harrison Pitt to say that he cares nothing for this country's, or what he calls, host people. Helena, there's some pretty weird things going on the right at the moment, aren't there? I mean, we've talked about it a number of times on the show, but an attempt to bring back ethnic nationalism, so to sort of not just, I think, sort of push back against like multiculturalism as an ideology, but also multi-ethnicity in the sense of people not being white in Britain. They want to make that controversial again, and with some pretty sloppy arguments about how we used to read Shakespeare and listen to Elgar, and now we don't. What do you think is going on here?
Well, I'd first like to say that it's funny to me about the kind of people who are concerned about this, that the phrase they use is UK as if that's the way nobody pronounces it, like the Y-O-O-K-A-Y. That's just how you pronounce it, unless you're incredibly posh. Like, it's just saying UK. Like, Y-O-O-K-A-Y that's just the natural pronunciation of that word. So that's very funny to me. But I think you're right. It is a very specific part of the online right, especially, who really have kind of embraced ethno-nationalism quite heavily. Right now, it's obvious that there is plenty of concern in this country about immigration, whether it's about irregular or regular migration. It's hot on the topic of lots of people in this country, and most people have it as their second concern or third concern around about the NHS and cost of living usually being the top three, right? So to try and claim that things such as integration or the high levels of demographic change on at least some part of at least a large amount of voters' minds, right? But this very specific bent of ethnic nationalism that we've recently seen, this really isn't particularly popular. It really isn't, right? So the More in Common pollster did a survey. This was just after the riots had happened last year, by the way, about whether people felt proud, ashamed, or they didn't care about the fact that the UK is a multi-ethnic country. And 48% said they were proud, 45% said neither of those things, and only 7% said they were ashamed. So this really does seem to be a very, very tiny minority when you actually look at the wider population. And it really is like an online thing for a lot of right-wingers, right? Like, you'll see that Rupert Lowe seems to be the kind of real figurehead in terms of politicians who really push ethno-nationalism. He's been very heavy in talking in explicitly ethno-nationalist terms on like his Twitter account. He gets huge numbers of retweets, huge numbers of likes, right? You must think he's very, very popular, but doesn't actually translate into real world success in terms of what the people of this country think. Well, no, Twitter isn't real life. And things reached a bizarre nadir where David Frost, like the Telegraph writer, who wrote that article that you quoted there, literally said, well, if you want to start learning about the UK phenomenon, you can follow this meme account on Twitter. And I'm like, well, at the time when you're trying to pin your ideological positions on Twitter meme accounts, I think we need to take a step back and take a look at what's going on here. When in reality, I think more what's close to the median position is kind of what Nigel Farage was saying in the run-up to the election, or just after the election, which was that actually, he said, immigration previously had been good. He praised, for example, the Windrush generation, which are the kind of people being slandered, in my mind, in my opinion here, by GB News in terms of the way in which they're portraying this stuff. He said, well, they were good. They came over to help build our country, right? It's only the mass migration recently that's been a problem because it helps slow down integration. No, I don't believe this is the case. That's not my particular position on this issue. I think the median consensus on this is slightly skewed by media reporting, but I can understand why they have those concerns. And that's way far away from the kind of ethno-nationalism that you're getting from people from GB News and from people like Rupert Lowe, in my opinion. So if Nigel Farage can understand this, but the rest of the people who he works with, these are his colleagues over at GB News, are so vastly out of step with public opinion. Like, it shows you just how kind of insular a lot of this stuff really is, because Farage is somebody who tries to pin himself to what he thinks is median opinion to try and garner votes, right? He doesn't think this ethno-nationalism is particularly useful for Reform UK's party brand. Probably that had some reason as to why there was such a campaign to get rid of Rupert Lowe from the party, because he only appeals to the headbangers and wingnuts, which are, again, in my mind, from what I've seen here, part of this online echo chamber. And one thing I would like to end on here is just a bit of a personal rant that really kind of got me, is the idea that somehow the fact that we have new kinds of fusion music in this country because of people arriving part of the Windrush generation or their children listening to grime or drill or dubstep or whatever it is, as this is somehow like, oh, no one listens to any of the old composers anymore. Would you think people in France are still listening to Camille Saint-Saëns in their going about their daily life? Of course they aren't. Fact is, in music culture in this country, there's been a huge amalgamation of our colonial past, for example, even far back as the Beatles, where people like this would consider a national treasure, were people who embraced things like the sitar and ragas from their time, engaging with people like Ravi Shankar, and that kind of cultural kind of cross-pollination is something that is so excellent about the kind of multi-ethnic and multicultural countries, and the wants to engage with different cultures as well, right? And that makes our country richer, not poorer. And the fact that these people are, again, as far as I said, is snooty, but the fact that they think that drill and grime music, which I think from lots of different perspectives has lots of artistic merit to it, is somehow completely devoid of merit. Again, as far as I can see, just for racist reasons, because it's the kind of music that ethnic minorities like to listen to, a lot of white people like it as well, by the way, is it shows to me that this is essentially, a lot of this is about racism, snobbery, and quite frankly, a bunch of completely baseless nostalgia, which doesn't even get any merit in terms of the previous country that we used to live in anyway. End of rant.
Comrade Jamie Vun says, I actually like Elgar, but that documentary is batshit. And I think on that note, we'll end the show. Helena, it's always an absolute pleasure having you on co-hosting when it's one of my hosting days.
Thank you very, very much. Much appreciated. I just want to clarify as well for that water story. In fact, the regional water boards literally got put under like special measures by the European Union. I think they got fined for lack of compliance, which is why they were forced to privatise. So it specifically was done from outside forces as well.
So it's the classic sort of run down the service and then privatise it. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.